All right, so we'll begin with foraging society, or otherwise known as hunting and gathering society. And what we already said about it is that in a foraging society, the subsistence pattern is hunting and gathering. In a foraging society, people produce for direct consumption. In other words, it is a subsistence society. So these societies are not accumulating or building up surpluses. They are not able to store surpluses. And there could be a lot of different reasons for that. If you remember Jared Diamond's film, one of the things he suggested was that, following people like Julian Stewart and his cultural ecology model, that if there are no uh, animals and plants in the environment that are amenable to or lend themselves to domestication, they aren't going to be domesticated. So there are these ecological and technical limitations to the ability of people to store surpluses. Foraging society uses an extensive strategy. So what we said about that before was small numbers of people, very low population numbers, very low population densities, people using very large areas of land, living in very large areas, using land temporarily, using areas temporarily. They are nomadic, so said here they are characterized by a high degree of spatial mobility. So they are constantly on the move, following food and water and so forth according to supply, according to availability, or according to seasons, etc. So they don't really stay in one place very long. There's a division of labor, and the division of labor is based on primarily on gender and age. And this division of labor is highly unspecialized. This is something we're going to be illustrating in just a few minutes. But if we say that there's a division of labor based on gender and age, there is some concept in this society of men's work and women's work. What is men's work and what is women's work? Sometimes that division of labor comes down to something like men hunting and women gathering, but that is not always true. One of the things I point out is that as you move from one hunting and gathering society to another, we're going to find all different kinds of variability in their gender division of labor. So, for example, men hunt, women gather, but what does that mean? Sometimes it might mean that, well, men do the hunting and women do the gathering. Like we're going to learn a little bit about Inuit society soon. And certainly that division is much more rigid. But in other places, you may have men responsible for hunting in certain areas, or women. In other words, women hunting near the camp and men hunting far away from the camp, or something like that. We also say that there is a gender division. There's a division of labor based on age. So there's an age division of labor, and that gender division of labor and that age division of labor comes together. So, for example, children who are able to, are going to maybe engage, whether they're men or women, whether they're male or female, I should say, are going to engage in some gathering activities. And people, maybe when they get too old to hunt and maybe even too old to gather, they're not as mobile anymore. They're going to be perhaps taking on more of the responsibilities for child care and so forth. So there's this gender division of labor and an age division of labor that kind of correspond to each other or overlap each other. And as we said, it's a division of labor that's highly unspecialized. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, there are two kinds of foraging society. So there's something we're going to call temperate climate foraging. I bet you were wondering what those little orange lines and circles were for. There's temperate climate foraging, and there's also circumpolar foraging. So think about how those differ, right? What's the difference between temperate climate foraging and circumpolar foraging? Well, the difference has to do with the environmental and ecological and climatological and other kinds of circumstances in which people live that maybe are going to influence the sorts of resources that are available, and therefore their approach actually to subsistence strategies. And I told you that we were going to come back to Nancy Bonvillain, and here we are. So she talks about or describes the Inuit, who maybe we would otherwise know as Eskimos, and talks about their division of labor. And we're making the point that the division of labor in a foraging society is highly unspecialized, and that there's a great deal of crossover between the way people work, right? Crossover between different kinds of jobs and so forth. There's a lot of flexibility in this division of labor. The Inuit have a much more, in fact, one of the things we say about the Inuit is that they have a much more rigid gender division of labor. And the reason for that is because they rely much more on hunted food rather than gathering food. So they'd be very different from the Kung in that sense. The Kung, for example, have access to all kinds of different plant foods and so gathered foods. And so actually the bulk of the Kung diet traditionally would come from gathered food. The Inuit living, in the circumpolar region, right, or living within the Arctic Circle, or near it, have less of those things available to them. So they rely much more on hunted food. Now, that means that this gender division of labor is a bit more rigid. But here's the point. Even where we recognize that the division of labor among the Inuit is much more rigid than it would be among, let's say, the Kung, there is still a great deal of flexibility in this division of labor and a great deal of crossover between men and women's work. And that's what I wanted to illustrate for you by doing a little bit of reading from Nancy Bonvillain. So here's what she said. Anthropologists often describe the economic roles of Arctic men and women as rigidly defined and separated, but references to actual behavior imply some flexibility. Some researchers do explicitly state the possibility of adjustments in activities. According to Nelson Grayburn, writing of the Central Canadian Inuit, here's what Nelson Grayburn said. The household was a social and economic unit maintained by an adult man and woman, usually husband and wife. Both were essential for successful existence in the Arctic, and numerous tasks of living were about evenly divided between men and women. Thus, the main division of labor was by sex, although Eskimo adults never hesitated to cross roles when this was warranted. So there you go. Never hesitated to cross roles when this was warranted. She continues. Nancy Bonvillain continues. She says, in general, men are responsible for hunting and fishing, and women engage in food preparation and gathering available foods such as berries, algae, and birds' eggs. Women are also responsible for childcare and for sewing, including the making of clothing, boots, boat covers, and containers. Cooperative labor of men and women occurs in inland communities during caribou drives. Fishing is also done by both women and men. Among coastal groups, women often engage in hunting, fishing, and catching birds near their settlements. In some communities, each individual makes the tools and utensils that he or she uses, whereas in others, men are the primary producers of equipment. Among some Arctic people, daughters may be trained by their fathers to become hunters. Listen to that again. Among some Arctic peoples, daughters may be trained by their fathers to become hunters. If a father especially prefers his daughter, or if he has no son, a daughter may accompany her father on hunting expeditions and learn all the requisite skills. Inuit ideally want at least one son and one daughter in order to fulfill complementary responsibilities. But if a family lacks children of each sex, one child may be trained in tasks usually associated with the other gender, in addition to their own gender-linked activities. Such individuals are valued as spouses because they have a double set of subsistence skills. So all of that illustrates this whole idea that this division of labor in a foraging society is highly flexible, and there is all kinds of variation and all kinds of crossover. So even if we think about Inuit society and what Nancy Bonvillain said, it is not unusual for a man to be a hunter as well as a sower, right? And even that kind of person, or a woman, right, a daughter, for example, who is a hunter and also able to do all the different kinds of tasks that women are supposed to do. In fact, that those people who possess the skills of both genders are considered as valuable marriage partners. They are desirable marriage partners because they have this double set of subsistence skills. So there are no strict, hard, fast rules about who does what kind of work. There's an idea of what is men's work and an idea of what is women's work, but men and women move back and forth between both of those all the time. Okay, so get that point. As we move through, as we go from foraging society to horticultural society to pastoral society to agricultural society, we're going to see that division of labor become more defined. All right, so just sort of pay attention to that as we go along here. And think about that chart where we're moving from left to right, from unspecialized to a specialized division of labor. So the next point we want to make about a foraging society is that it is based on an idea or a concept of property surrounding the notion of use rights. Use rights, again, very different from exclusionary rights. So all notions about property in a foraging society revolve around this idea of use rights. That is, that my possessing something or even my owning something does not exclude you from its use. This is why, if you think back to eating Christmas in the Kalahari, remember that the Kung were trying to teach Richard Lee a lesson about generosity, right? And about obligation to the band. And they saw him as a stingy person, right? Because he had all this food and he would not share it. He had tobacco and he was the one who controlled it. So just because he owned the tobacco in the Kung mind, from the Kung concept, did not exclude the Kung from their right to it or having access to it. The same with food. If he has food from the Kung value system, he's obligated to share it, and he didn't because of for his research purposes. But that's what motivated them to want to teach him the lesson, right, about what it means to give a gift and what it means to share. So foraging, hunting and gathering society was the dominant mode of human existence for about 90% of the time we have existed as a species. For most the overwhelming majority of the time that we've been on this planet as human beings, we have lived as hunter-gatherers. Everything else that happened has only developed within the last 10,000 years, maybe. So we have a really important question that we have to ask, and that is, if hunting and gathering was so good, why did we ever leave it? And that's a very important question, and I think that there are several, or at least two different answers to that question that are both going to bring us to the same point. So, again, if hunting and gathering was so good, why did we ever leave? Or was it so good? So, one answer to this question comes from this gentleman. This is Marshall Solins, very famous American anthropologist, and back in 1972, he wrote a very influential book called Stone Age Economics. It's a book that we are still talking about even now. And in that book, he has in his first chapter, which is entitled The Original Affluent Society, a discussion of why we left hunting and gathering society. Now, he's still around. 1930, he was born. He's 89 years old. And there's his book, Stone Age Economics. So his explanation for why we left hunting and gathering society was basically this. He said that, first of all, we got to think about this word affluence. What does that mean? Well, usually when we think of the word affluence, we think of wealth. We think of people being free from need because they have so much wealth. And in our society, that affluence is measured by our ability to consume goods, because we are a consumerist society and we consume massive amounts of goods. But he talks about hunting and gathering society as the original affluent society, but their affluence to him was based on something completely different. They were not consumerists, they were minimalists, right? They were consuming only what they needed to subsist, right? They were consuming only, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they were living on the edge of starvation, but it means that they were only consuming what was necessary to maintain themselves, to meet their basic needs. And his idea was that hunting and gathering was actually a very successful mode of livelihood. And he bases this on data that he's getting from anthropology, including the work of Richard Lee, who was, talking about the Kung, a kind of contemporary hunting and gathering society. And he was also looking at archaeological evidence. And he came to the conclusion that life in a hunting and gathering society was actually pretty good, that people could meet their needs with a very low level of labor input. They really didn't have to work all that much to keep themselves going. In fact, if we look at Richard Lee's work, when he does that time allocation study, he finds that the Kung can sustain themselves working on average about 3 hours a day. The rest of the time, as Marshall Solins also points out, is that they were able to engage in what we might think of as leisure time. They had leisure time. So their affluence was really surrounded around the quality of life, that they didn't have to, work themselves to death. They didn't have to work 40, 50 hours a week. They were working 3 hours a day, maybe. And the rest of the time they had to take care of their children and interact with their children and interact with each other and sing their songs and practice their rituals and so forth. So this is what he's saying. It says their affluence was not based on the quantity of what they consumed. Their affluence was based on the quality, right, of their lifestyle, quality of life. But he gets back to the question, well, why did we ever leave it? And the answer he gives to that is because hunting and gathering society was too successful. Now, we have an explanation here that's kind of like Marvin Harris, cultural materialism, right? How culture is related to uh, the material conditions under which people live. So, what we want to think about is um, population sizes, right, in relationship to available resources. So Marshall Solins was saying that hunting and gathering was too successful. In other words, it was so successful that human populations began to increase. And as the human populations began to increase, they began to put some pressure on resources. And that led to what Marvin Harris would call a need to intensify, right? A need to capture more energy to sustain these larger populations. And so the fact that population sizes were putting pressure on the availability of resources, that led to the need for a technological revolution, right? It led to the domestication revolution. And so it led people to become horticulturalists. And when they become horticulturalists, they are being proactive. They're not just relying on the luck of the draw. They're not just relying on fate. They're taking action. They are being proactive. They are assuring that there's going to be some availability of food. On the other hand, you have an explanation that kind of follows the way Jared Diamond talked about it, and that is one that's based on not on population growth but on resource scarcity. So if you remember Jared Diamond's film, he talked about how ecological conditions had changed to the extent that there was, it was very dry. Conditions were very dry in the Middle East, and that meant that it became harder and harder and harder to sustain hunting and gathering groups on simple hunting and gathering alone. So where Marshall Solins is talking about population increase putting pressure on resources, what Jared Diamond was saying was that scarcity of resources led to the need for this same kind of intensification that Marvin Harris talked about. So that led to people having to become horticulturalists, having to become farmers. That's what led, in Jared Diamond's mind, to domestication of resources. So we have or domestication of society. So we have two different explanations that both lead us to the same thing. We have Marshall Solins, population increase. It means population increase is what led to the need to intensify through domestication. Where we have Jared Diamond, resource scarcity is what led to the need for intensification through domestication of plants. In any case, around 10,000 years ago, we do finally leave hunting and gathering life and become horticulturalists. And we also become pastoralists. And that's what we're going to be turning to next.